So a few years ago, or a couple years ago, before we planted New City Church, as many of you know, I worked at Verizon for a few years, and I hated it. Have some good friendships that I kept to this day, but part of the problem was I worked in the retail store in the sales side, and so you were tracked on everything that you sold, which is fine, except when you're a very competitive person and you're always in the bottom third of sales. Now, there are two reasons for this in my defense. One is that I didn't really believe in the product, if you will. Like, yes, people should have phones, but we were supposed to sell all this extra stuff that people don't actually need. And so I felt bad because I'm a pretty big budget guy and, not spending money that you don't need. And so we're trying to push all of this stuff that people cannot afford and they don't need. And so that was a problem for me. The other problem for me was I tried to be honest. And so a lot of the top sales reps, to give you a behind the scenes curtain the next time you are at a phone store, there's a lot of promotions that are going on at various times. And so they would say things like, I can lower your bill if you buy a tablet. And if they didn't buy a tablet, well, they wouldn't change their plan, which they should change the plan regardless, right? And so they would do stuff like that to make you buy things you didn't need. And so it got to the point where I was pretty frustrated. However, I never got in trouble. My managers liked me. Everyone, was fine. I think because they were like, well, it's probably good that we have at least one honest person that works here to help people out if there's a problem. And so I started to track, and I made a spreadsheet of how many people I needed to interact with a day in order to hit certain sales goals. And so you have what's called upgrades when somebody kind of renews their contract or gets another phone, and you have new lines where if somebody's adding a line to their account. Now, the new lines is where you get paid. The upgrades don't really mean anything. And so basically for me is how many people do I have to see a day in order to get a couple of new lines every day? And so I would have people I saw, then what their issue was. Was it an upgrade? Was it buying a new line? Was it a tech problem? Was it a bill problem? So I didn't know how many people I needed to see, and so I was trying to do all this work to figure out how many people, again, do I need to see a day to hit certain sales goals. And so, again, it showed me I need to interact with this amount of people, and so it makes you be a little bit more aggressive because, when some people walk in, if they have an issue, people try to scope them out and they got a bill in their hand, so I'm going to avoid you and make someone else help them. And so I didn't do that, right? I wanted to find a way of how can I do a better job without being, shady as I'm trying to sell people things. I didn't know, and so I had to go out of my way to figure it out. Well, today we are continuing our time in the book of Exodus, and we are, my goal is last week we looked at the Ten Commandments. Today we're going to be in Exodus chapter 20 through 24, and we're going to be looking at some more laws and details. And one of my hopes is to show us that how we view the law is actually wrong. A lot of times we think it's restrictive and it's bad, when it's really God's grace to us, in particular to the Israelites, of what does it look like to honor him and live in community with one another. And so today we're going to be covering 4 chapters, and so I'm not going to read all of them for you. You're welcome. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be looking at passages all over the place, and so you're welcome to follow along in the Bibles if you would like. Or all of the scriptures are going to be on your screen. I have notes with me today, so this will feel a little bit different because there's no way I could remember all of this. But here's the good news. Today, a lot of times people talk about when you try to read through the Bible in a year that Leviticus is when people stop reading the Bible. That's not true. Today is when people stop reading the Bible. Last week was the Ten Commandments. That's the last thing that makes sense for a while, and so things fall apart. And so I just want to say this. If you're with us or you're watching online and you've been following Jesus for your whole life, or this is your first day ever in church, we are all on the same playing field because ain't nobody know what's going on here, right? And so I'm going to try to shed some light in this. Again, we're looking at the story of Israel, how God rescued them out of bondage and slavery in Egypt. He's bringing them through the wilderness to God's promised land, but he's showing them and he's demonstrating to them in this section, what does it look like to honor me and to live in community? Because they've never done this before and they have no idea what it looks like. And so last week we saw the Ten Commandments, which is kind of a big summation of the law, if you will. And today, in this section, there's actually 50 commands and laws and repercussions if you do not follow them. And so kind of in a little bit more detail, Moses is on Mount Sinai meeting with God and learning some of these laws. And so in this section, these 4-ish chapters, you'll read things about altars, slaves, restitution for wrongdoing, social justice, and Sabbath, and festivals. Again, how can they interact with one another and with God? Now, the thing about this is it's confusing, right? Their customs, their traditions, their laws, a lot of them don't make sense for us because we don't live in this time and this place. And so what happens is as we go through these laws, they seem kind of irrelevant, and so we don't know what to do with them. So, for example, in Exodus 22, verse 1, it says this: when a man steals an ox or a sheep and butchers it or sells it, he must repay 5 cattle for the ox or 4 for the sheep. Now, when we read this, I think that's wrong on the screen. It should be Exodus 22, verse 1, but that's okay. When we read stuff like this, we're like, sheep and ox, I don't have that. What am I supposed to do with that? It doesn't make a lot of sense. Or in Exodus chapter 20, verse 25, it says this, if you make a stone altar for me, do not build it out of cut stones. If you use your chisel on it, you will defile it. And so you're like, what? Like you're trying to build an altar to worship God, and there's certain tools you can and cannot use. We don't build these altars. We don't know what to do with it. It's confusing. So you have some laws that seem irrelevant, and then you have some laws that seem intense. So, for example, in 21:17, it says this, whoever curses his father or his mother must be put to death. And we read that and we say, okay, what do you mean by curse? Like how far, where's the line on this, right? It's intense. We're not sure what to do with it. And then not only do we have laws that are intense, we have laws that make us uncomfortable. In 21:7, it says this, when a man sells his daughter as a concubine, she is not to leave as the male slaves do. What are we supposed to do with that? 22:16 and 17, it's another one. It says this, if a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and he sleeps with her, he must certainly pay the bridal price for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must pay an amount in silver equal to the bridal price for virgins. So if a man sleeps with a woman who's not engaged, he's supposed to marry her. If a man rapes a woman and she's not engaged, is he supposed to marry her? We read these and we understandably are confused and maybe a little uncomfortable. But here's the thing. What we can do, again, because they're irrelevant, they're intense, they're uncomfortable, we're not quite sure what to do with them, we can skip them. And when we do that, we miss an opportunity to learn about what God is like and how he interacts with us. Right? If we skip these laws that he's giving to the Israelites, even if we're not in their context, we miss the opportunity to learn who he is, more of his character, and how he interacts with his people. And so again, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a couple of these, and my hope is that we will see, part of the kind of thing that people throw against Christians, particularly in the Old Testament, is they say things like, well, you just pick and choose, right? This whole selling women thing, obviously you don't follow that, but these other things we're supposed to follow. I can't believe Christians do that. My hope today is that we could take a step back and ask, is that actually a fair criticism, or is there something else actually going on? I love what it says in 2 Peter chapter 4. Peter, who was a follower of Jesus, is writing to a fellow followers of Jesus, and he says this, and I think this is helpful for us as we kind of dive into Exodus. It'll be on the screen. 2 Peter 3, it says this. Therefore, dear friends, while you wait for these things, in other words, he's talking about following Jesus and waiting for him to kind of grow our faith, make every effort to be found without spot or blemish in his sight at peace. Also, regard the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our dear brother Paul, who wrote other books in the New Testament, has written to you according to the wisdom given to him. He speaks about all these things in all of his letters. There are some things that are hard to understand in them, right? And you know this if you're familiar with the New Testament. Even in the Old Testament, right? There's things that are hard to understand. So he says this, the untaught and unstable will twist them to their own destruction, as they do with the rest of the scriptures. Therefore, dear friends, since you know this in advance, be on your guard, so that you are not led away by the error of lawless people and fall from your own stable position, but grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. To him be the glory both now and to the day of eternity. So what Peter is warning against, reading some of Paul's letters, it's the same thing that is true for us as we read the Old Testament. He's saying, don't be ignorant and unstable like those who twist the scriptures. And this is a place where many people do this. Now, some people do this out of ignorance, and I don't mean this in a negative way. I mean, they just don't have spent no time kind of reading the Bible, and so they read some of these laws that I just talked about, like especially the laws about women, that make us uncomfortable, and they say, I can't believe you believe that. Christians are so dumb. And then you have people who do this intentionally, right? In fact, I read a book recently about why Christianity is wrong. It's good to read things that you disagree with. And one of the weak points of his book was he actually talked about some of these Old Testament laws and said, see, Christians, they can't believe they do this. And he spent no time maybe taking a step back and understanding why. It doesn't mean we don't have questions. It doesn't mean we might not still be uncomfortable. But could it be that there's something going on there that even just a little bit of study might help us with? So, for example, as we look at some of these laws in the Old Testament, I think we need to be honest, right? Unless you are, which to my knowledge, no one at New City Church is, unless you're an ancient Near Eastern scholar, like have a PhD level in studying ancient cultures in the Near East, then you have to admit that you do not fully understand the context of what's going on here. You just have to admit that. Now, of course, we should spend some time looking at these things, and we will this morning, but we should be uncomfortable saying, well, maybe I'm not quite sure why a law says this before I kind of completely dismiss it. Let me just take maybe 30 minutes and figure out what is going on. I would suggest if you do that, these laws actually become a lot more beautiful than if you just kind of dismiss them and take no time to understand the context, because our context is not like theirs, and if we don't do that, we won't know what's going on. And again, one of the big problems of viewing the Old Testament law that we talked about last week is that we often view them in the abstract. The Ten Commandments, those kind of seem to make sense, but even some of these other ones, we forget that they were written to a time, a place, a people, a context, and in a certain order, right? Israel was redeemed first, and after they had seen that God loved them and provided for them, then they are encouraged to follow who this God actually is. And so again, what we typically do is, because they are confusing, we'll take a couple of laws that maybe make sense to us, and we say, well, maybe we'll just follow those. So for example, in 23:1, it says this: "You must not spread a false report. Do not join the wicked to be a malicious witness." So that makes sense to us, right? Don't lie about people, don't spread false reports, don't gossip. And so we think that makes sense. But then again, we would object to treating women as property. And so we're left with the question, what do we actually do? Now, here's what I want to do. Before we kind of dive into a couple of these laws, and this morning I'm going to look at two in particular to shed some light on maybe some of the other ones. I think it would be helpful, maybe before we look too negatively to some of these laws, to realize that we have some of our own in the United States of America today that are weird, that don't make a lot of sense. Let me just read some of them to you. For example, in Arizona, donkeys cannot sleep in bathtubs. So that law is still in the books. If you find yourself in Arizona and you find yourself with a donkey, don't give him a bath, right? For some reason, that is a law still on the books in Arizona. It's kind of weird, but it's a law that we have. Here's another one. In Delaware, you are forbidden to sell the hair of a dog. I don't know if that's a thing that you do other places, but if you're in Delaware and you want to shave your dog, throw it away, don't sell it. In Wyoming, again, this one's kind of weird. It's illegal to remove more than half of a sheep's ear. So you can cut like 50% or 49%, but once you get to 51, don't do it, right? That's still on the books in Wyoming. And maybe here's the last one that's pretty awesome actually in Alabama. It's this, that it's illegal to wrestle a bear. And so, if you're in Alabama and you come up to a bear and you beat that sucker to the ground, you ain't better not tell anybody about it because you're going to jail, okay? So that's a law. It's kind of weird. That just like we might think the Old Testament. Now, here's the thing. We also have weird laws about women, right? On the Book of the Covenant, there's laws about women that we're going to get into. We have some weird laws about women that are still legal. For example, here's a few of them. In Michigan, a woman is not allowed to cut her own hair without her husband's permission. So we have a few Michiganites, here at New City Church. Okay. I don't know if you should be that excited to be from Michigan after reading that. Now, here's what we know. The other 49 states in the United States of America have an unwritten law that men cannot cut their hair without getting their wife's permission. And so maybe that makes up for it. In Charlotte, North Carolina, right, our own backyard, don't get too excited, there is an ordinance that requires women to cover their bodies with at least 16 yards of cloth at all times out in public. I don't know how that's possible. I don't know how that was ever a thing. There's also an ordinance in Charlotte, North Carolina, that forbids women from wearing tight clothes. So if you're a woman in Charlotte, you can't win. Just don't go there. Here's the last one, right? Here's the last one. In Memphis, Tennessee, a woman cannot drive a car unless there is a man with a red flag in front of her warning others on the road. Now, again, these are still legal today. Now, here's what we know, right? Obviously, these are no longer enforced, right? For good reason. They're no longer enforced, but at some point, for some reason, they were deemed important. Now, I am not comparing our weird laws in the United States to the laws that God divinely gives the Israelites, but I'm just saying, context can help understanding what is going on. And so again, in Exodus 21, verse 1, it says this: "These are the ordinances that you are to set before them." So God is going to give Moses a various amount of laws and ordinances that the Israelites are supposed to follow, as well as repercussions if they break them. And so in these 4-ish chapters, there are approximately 50 of them. There's approximately 50 laws in these 4 chapters that talk about what they should do and punishments if you break these crimes or offenses. Again, There's laws about altars, slaves, restitution and injury and harm, personal and public holiness, social justice, and Sabbath and festivals. A lot of various things about what they're supposed to do. Now, I would submit to you, as Jesus does and the rest of Scripture talks about, that the root of all of these laws is two things: that we are to love God and to love others. The love of God and the love of neighbor. Now, again, we're going to see how that makes sense with some of these that make us uncomfortable, but I think it's even interesting on the surface level. It's just a surface level reading. You will find in these 4 chapters that about half of the laws that are written here deal with segments of the population who were the most vulnerable, and in other societies had no laws written for them at all. And so you see laws about the oppressed, the weak, poor, common victims, and even women. And so a slow and steady reading shows us that there's something significant here. Even if we have questions about the laws themselves, there's something significant here that the oppressed and other cultures who have no one to speak to them, God says, we're going to take some time and put some specific things on the books, if you will, about how to treat the marginalized. And so again, we're not going to read all of them, but I think it would be helpful for us to maybe just read 2 of these laws in these couple 4-ish chapters that make us uncomfortable, that make us defensive, or may even seem offensive to us, and show that they are actually a gift to the vulnerable if you just take a few minutes and understand why they were given. One of my favorite things about this is that this is not a sympathetic Christian reading into the Old Testament. So this is not I just want to make these laws sound better so that we can worship Jesus and pretend they don't exist. This is actually, if you take some time, Christian or not, you actually begin to see something quite beautiful. So I want to spend a couple of minutes on 2 of the laws. You probably never heard these preached before. So here we go. We like to do hard things at New City. 21 verse 2 and 3, here's what it says. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve for 6 years. Then in the 7th, he is to leave as a free man without paying anything. And so on the 7th year, however long he's been a slave, he is to be released for free. If he arrives alone, he is to leave alone. If he arrives with his wife is to leave with him. Now for us, we read this, and from the first sentence, we get caught up by a slave. And we have a hard time getting past that, and we certainly should, right? Because what comes to mind? American shadow-based slavery, where it's lifelong, it's forced, it's brutal, it's horrific, and so we think, well, why would God allow that? Now, it's helpful to understand that's not the same thing that's happening here. I'm not saying that you would enjoy to be someone in this position who had to sell themselves as a slave, but it's not the same thing as we think of in an American context, and in fact, there are actually laws that are specifically written in the Old Testament that go against the shadow-based slavery that we are used to, which is why it is sad that many men in our nation's history did with the Old Testament what Peter warned against in 2 Peter. They twisted the scriptures for their own gain to promote their sinful ambitions. In fact, in 21:16, so just a few verses later, here's what it says. It says, whoever kidnaps a person must be put to death, whether he sells him or the person is found in his possession. In other words, if you steal someone and make them a slave, and if you buy someone that was stolen, you both have to be put to death. You cannot do that. And so what it's talking about here in chapter 21, verses 2 and 3, it's talking about someone who voluntarily sells themselves into slavery for someone to work for somebody else. Now, again, that still makes us uncomfortable, but remembering the context helps us understand what is going on here. Remember, in the ancient world and in Israel and all over the world at this time, there are no businesses. There are no corporations. There are no HR departments. You have a house and you drive to someplace to work. That does not happen. In this context, virtually everybody worked for a person or a family. That's how you worked and that's how you survived. And so maybe you worked someone's land or you used somebody's tools to do something. And so what would happen is you would essentially get paid for your service, but your labor, whatever you produced, would be given to the people who own you. Now, in modern terms, here's what we do, right? We typically, you contract with if you want to put modern terms on it, you would contract with a person, a family, just like you work a normal job, and they own the rights to your labor. So in the Israelite context, they wouldn't own you as a person, they would just own the things that you produced. Now, we have modern equivalencies of these in the United States and in the world today, but because we understand the terminology, we don't look at it weirdly like we look at the text in the Hebrew Bible. So, for example, there are 2 modern-day examples of this. Sports in the military, right? Sports, for example, you hear things like this as we have the Super Bowl tonight. So this is a familiar thing, right? You hear about players being released. You hear about players signing as a free agent with a team. You hear about players who are bought or sold. In European soccer, they use this terminology a lot. They loan a player, or they buy a player, or they sell a player. You have owners. Now, when you actually sit there and think of it, it's like, okay, maybe that is kind of weird. But on the surface level, it doesn't trip us up. Why? Because we understand what is happening. You sign with the team, and everything you produce on the field goes to the team's credit and benefit. So you see this in sports. You also see this in the military, right? In the military, you enlist, you voluntarily sign up for service, and they do not own you. Now, if you've been in the military, you might disagree with that. You might say, well, they kind of do. But technically speaking, they don't. And so you still have personal privileges and rights, but you are in the service of the military. I think the military is also might be a better example because not generally speaking, but for many people, they might join the military out of high school because they don't have other prospects. Maybe they can't afford college. They might have less income than others, and so they join the military. Maybe they would do something else if they had another option, but for some people, it's the best that they can in the situation that they have, and so they do it. And so the truth is, when you join the military, you have voluntarily contract with them for a predetermined amount of time, and if you break it early, there are serious consequences. So in some sense, it might seem like they own you, but they don't actually own you. And so in this context, if you understand this and you read these Old Testament laws about slavery, you would actually think quite differently. You know, a Hebrew slave would hear these laws, and they would actually be a refuge to them. You say, why is that? Well, they would say, hold up, my family can't be broken apart. Like if I enter into this with a family, I can leave with my family. Or there's other laws that if you enter in as a free man, for example, and you get married at the end of your 6 years, you can leave as a free man, or you can stay with your wife and your children. Right? My family can't be broken up. Again, remember the context that the Egyptians broke up their families to build store cities all around Egypt. They would hear things like, and we're not going to read it this morning, but they would hear laws that talk about what would happen if their owner was abusive for them, and that they would have consequences. You see, reread 21, 2 and 3 about Hebrew slaves, and we think, are you serious? They would have thought the exact same thing, but flipped on its head. They would have said, are you serious? That there are rules for my owners? That they can't break my family apart? They have to treat me equally? This is quite amazing. Let me give you another one. In 21, verse 7 through 11, it says this. When a man sells his daughter as a concubine, she is not to leave as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing to her master, who chose her for himself, then he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has acted treacherously toward her. Or if he chooses her for his son, he must deal with her according to the customary treatment of daughters. If he takes an additional wife, he must not reduce the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. And if he does not leave these three things for her, she may leave free of charge without any payment. Now again, from our context, we read this and we say, how does a culture, God's people nonetheless, treat a woman this way? Right? A man is selling his daughter as a slave. How could God allow this? Now, before I answer that question, I think it would be helpful for us to do a thought experiment, if you will, about our culture today. I think if we, again, understandably, we look at these laws and they make us uncomfortable, but I think if you were to take an Israelite woman, let's say a poor Israelite woman, and port them into our context, I think they would also have some questions. And maybe our culture is not as progressive as we might think. So let me just give you an example. For example, let's say you're sitting on the couch, and this woman walks in and she says, hey, what are you watching? After getting over the initial shock of what a TV is, right? You say this to her. You say, guess what? So I'm watching this show and it's awesome. What they do is they take 25 women and they put them in a house and they make them fight over one man. And in the end, 24 of them are going to be rejected and millions of people are going to watch it and love it and cheer. Now, I'm not making a moral judgment on The Bachelor. But I'm just saying, that's kind of weird, right? And I think someone not from this context, particularly a woman, might think, that's kind of weird. I'm not saying you can or you cannot watch. I'm just saying, in our culture, we can be blinded by the things that we do and think there's no problems with it when, It's an interesting concept to say the least. Let me give you one more example. This one is a little bit more intense. Imagine telling this Israelite woman that we've got this thing called pornography, where you can watch millions of women perform sexual acts completely for free. And on top of that, studies consistently correlate things like sexual abuse, domestic violence, and rape to pornography use. And on top of that, we have virtually no laws and regulation against it. I would submit to you, who are we? Who are we? Now, as a side, I just want to say, if pornography is an issue that you are struggling with it, which it is for the majority of people, I want to tell you that there is grace, and there is love, and there's forgiveness, and we would love to walk alongside you with that. But we have to call it what it is. It is evil. And we seem to think in our culture today that we are high and mighty and that we treat women with equal respect and love and dignity, and we are woefully short in the way that we treat women even today in the 21st century. So we're not as great as we think we are. Now, that being said, you'd be like, okay, Dylan, I give that to you. But why would God allow a man to sell his daughter, right? So again, that's not a good thing, but still it's a law that there's like trying to be regulation against how this goes down. Why would God just say outright, don't do it? Well, I think, again, it's helpful to know the context. A man would not sell his daughter because he was trying to make money off of her. That's not how this would actually happen. In fact, in situations where this occurred, a man would sell his daughter because he is trying to actually improve her prospects for marriage and family in the future. Here's what we know. Being a single woman today is hard. If you're a single adult woman, it is hard for you. It is even harder in this context where as poor a job as our court systems do with things like sexual abuse and domestic violence and that sort of thing, they didn't even have a chance for that back then. Men could do whatever they want, whenever they wanted, with no restitution, generally speaking. And so God here is trying to deal with the Israelites where they are and treat women with dignity and respect. And so the context behind when this would happen is here's what would happen. You would have a poor man who is struggling to provide for his family, cannot afford a wedding or anything like that. And so in this context, a poor man could, if he wanted, send his daughter to a more affluent family in the hopes that she would be part of and included into that family through marriage. Right? And so the hopes are there's not a lot of prospects. His daughter might be facing an adult singlehood as a woman, which is going to be really difficult to survive. And so he is trying to do something to help her prospects of marriage and her life in general. And so there's laws about how this could go down. And even in that, there are laws behind making sure the woman is taken care of. And so, for example, if the arrangement didn't work out, as we read, and a man changes his mind and says, you know what, actually, I don't want to have this woman as a part of my family, he's not allowed to just sell her off. He can't do that. If she marries one of his sons, so let's say he takes this woman to be a wife for one of his sons, she is to be treated like family and given full rights. She can't be less than. And if the engagement ended, or a man took another wife, even if she is a second wife, she cannot be treated less than. Now, the Bible never speaks positively of men marrying more than one woman. We don't have time to talk about it right now, but that was just the context and culture that they were in. And so it's saying, if this happens, here's how you're supposed to treat the women. Now, I think a lot of us would be like, well, God should just tell us what we should do, and he should not make any concessions about our life and where we are. And I hear you. But I do want to submit this to us. If God told us what to do and didn't deal with us where we are, none of us could measure up. When God covenants with human beings, it's going to be messy because we are messy, and yet he is going to give us grace and forgiveness. And so what God says in this common cultural practice, when you do this, here's how the women are supposed to be treated. And what's interesting, again, if you keep reading these laws, which we won't this morning, but you get more laws for women, for servants, for poor, for widows, and the orphans. And again, on a surface level reading, we talk about, I can't believe they have all these laws for women. How repressive. But here's the thing. If they didn't have these laws for women, they would be treated even worse than they already are because men could do whatever they wanted. And God's saying that is not how my people are going to treat one another. Right? This is completely different than what we think on a surface level reading. We could spend more time in this, and I'm not saying you still don't have questions, but what is going on here is not what we assume is going on here, even when just with a few minutes of study. And so again, if you keep reading, you see all these other laws. And in chapter 22, verse 21, it says this, You must not exploit a resident alien or oppress him, since you were resident aliens in the land of Egypt, right? They were slaves, they were aliens, they were foreigners. And so when people join on the Israelite cause, that no matter their ethnicity or their background, they weren't allowed to be treated. They weren't allowed to be put into forced slavery. They had to be treated just like a fellow Israelite. There are even laws to protect the unborn. I mean, there are laws for everything, and all other surrounding cultures didn't have, because they didn't have a God that was concerned about all people, not just the people in power. And so remember, when God covenants with humans, it is messy because we are broken and we are fallen. And even where we are, God is trying to demonstrate to us how to love each other well and how to honor him. In other words, if I could sum up some of these laws this morning, and as we understand them maybe differently than how we would assume, here's what I would say. That God's laws are given to God's people to demonstrate God's love. And we miss this if we skip the laws or we take no time trying to understand their context. When you take time trying to understand their context, they start to mean something completely different than how we assume they mean in a 21st century context. His laws are given to his people to demonstrate his love. This is why when Jesus says in the New Testament that all of the law and the prophets are summed up in loving God and loving other people, it's not some pithy phrase. It's not some, I'm going to say this so that people in the 21st century can say, Christianity is awesome because it's all about love. He's saying this because it is true. In the context and place and situation that they found themselves, God is trying to show them how to honor him and how to love each other. And again, if you take on top of that, the context and the order in which the law was given, the law was a response to redemption. They were saved, they were redeemed first. This is not a precondition for redemption. Same in our case, right? Jesus has come, given his life for us, and so we honor God, not as kind of like an entrance exam to get us to love him, but because he loved us first, we honor him in response so that we can see and experience more of who he is. The law, in other words, is not a burden. It was actually a liberation to show the people how to best live in community with one another. That is what these laws are for. And so after giving a bunch of these laws, and again, with that in mind, I would encourage you to go back and read through some of these laws. If you have questions, spend some time looking into it. You might actually find it's quite beautiful. Here's what happens next. In Exodus chapter 24, it says this. Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and it says, Moses came and told the people all the commands of the Lord and all the ordinances. Then all the people responded with a single voice. We will do everything that the Lord has commanded. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early the next morning and set up an altar. Didn't use a chisel, by the way, I'm sure. Set up an altar and 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel at the base of the mountain. Then he sent out the young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half the blood and set it in basins. The other half of the blood he splattered on the altar. And then he took the covenant scroll and read it aloud to the people. They responded, we will do and obey all the Lord has commanded. After this, Moses goes back up the mountain. He takes Joshua with him, and Israel's going to stay in camp at the bottom of Mount Sinai for a while as Moses receives more laws about the tabernacle, about ordinances, and gets the 10 Commandments written in stone. And so it goes back up the mountain. Now, all that to be said, I know I've covered a lot, so you've done a great job. As Christians today, you might say, okay, I still have questions about the law, but I can see how that actually might be more loving and beautiful than I assume. The question still remains for us, what are we supposed to do with them, right? Even if you say, okay, I grant you, the law is demonstrating God's love for us. Are we supposed to follow them? What are we supposed to do? Well, what I want to do, I want to real quick, read you a few sentences from a biblical scholar named Peter Enns. I could try to summarize what he would say, but it would take me longer, and it wouldn't be as concise. I love, and I think he sums this up well, about how if you're a follower of Jesus today, how you are supposed to view and follow the Old Testament law. Here's what he says. When all is said and done, when I read the book of the covenant, the first thought that pops into my mind is not, how do I bring these laws into my life? How do I follow them today? He said, that's not the first thing we should ask. Rather, the first thing I think of is now I see better how God dealt with his people soon after the Exodus. Remember the time and place they were given. This is not to say that none of these laws has any relevance to our conduct, but I am not about to draw up a list of laws that apply or those that don't. So he's not trying to say, well, these ones apply today and these ones don't. Instead, nor am I going to abstract principles from these laws to apply to current situations. So, if like sheep and goats, if someone steals a sheep, I don't have a sheep, what do I do? So I'm not trying to abstract that to a current situation. Instead, he says this, I remain convinced that we as Christians are supposed to glean from the book of the covenant, or what we're supposed to glean, is an understanding of the nature of God and what he requires of his people, and what Jesus summarized as loving God and treating your neighbor as yourself. And the good news is that Jesus came, what did he do? He fulfilled the law. He didn't abolish it. He didn't say it was bad. He fulfilled it. Why? Because Jesus is the perfect embodiment of love. And if the laws are supposed to demonstrate God's love for us, well, it would make sense that Jesus would fulfill them. And so we are no longer under the specific requirements of ancient Middle Eastern Israelites, right? We're in a different context and culture. This is not picking and choosing. It's just different for us. And so what we are to do, though, instead, is to emulate Jesus and pursue love. Instead of saying, okay, which Old Testament laws do I follow and which do I not? I think the better question for us is this: what does love require of me? In my context, in my situation, what does love require of me? And that is how you fulfill the law of the Old Testament. Last thing I'll read in 1 John chapter 5, one of Jesus' disciples, John, writes this. He says, "This is how we know that we love God's children, when we love God and obey his commands. For this is what the love of God is, to keep his commands, and his commands are not a burden." Remember, God's laws are given to God's people to demonstrate God's love. He gave it to a people who were broken, who were fallen, who did not understand what it meant to honor God and to live in community. And he showed them that I love you, and you're going to treat each other with kindness and respect. Why? Because the world is watching, and I want them to see a community of people who are changed by my love. And the same is true for us today as followers of Jesus. The world is watching, and God wants to use a people who have been changed by his love, so that as many people as possible, as we say our mission here at New City Church, is to help people meet Jesus and grow in a relationship with him. We are a people who are redeemed first, and in response to that love, we honor God and love people so that we can experience more of his grace and his kindness in our life. God's love are given to God's people to demonstrate God's love, and the perfect fulfillment of that is Jesus coming, dying on our behalf, fulfilling the law on our behalf, so that we as a people, in the midst of our falling short, of our sins, and of our brokenness, can experience his grace and who he is. Again, God's laws are given to God's people to demonstrate God's love. Let's pray.